So I'm Randall Rouser, Director of Faith-Based Organization Investigations at Veritassolutions, and today I'm happy to be joined by Dan Koch. Dan is a licensed therapist in the state of Washington, creator of the Spiritual Harm and Abuse Scale, which was published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion in 2022, and he's also host of the You Have Permission podcast. You can visit him online and learn more about his work, including the scale, at dankochwords.com. Dan, it's great to have you joining us today.
It's a lot better to be here than it was trying to figure out a URL for my website. I'll tell you that much.
So was that just your name already taken?
Yeah, taken. Oh yeah. So I had to add words. I was like, well, there's some podcasting, there's some writing. I don't want to do a podcast.com, whatever. It's a whole thing. It's over now.
That's cool. Yeah. Fortunately, when I got my URL years ago, my name's not that common. Not that yours is necessarily common, but nobody had claimed randallrouser.com back in 2009. So I was smooth sailing.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's not super common. It's like just common enough that I can never get my name on Instagram or Google or anything like that.
That's it. Awesome. All right. So I wanted to talk to you today about your work in this scale of spiritual harm and abuse, because this is an area that I work in, and I think it's enormously important. And I think maybe just to kind of get us going, I'd love to hear from you. What drew you to the topic in the first place?
Yeah, so I experienced some spiritual abuse growing up evangelical. Specifically, mine was centered around end times teaching. When I was 11, I was given a short book by an adult at my Christian elementary/junior high that basically claimed that Christ would return in about 6 months. And it sent my life into a tailspin in the way you might imagine that happening for an 11-year-old. And from there, that became kind of the most common trigger for panic attacks in my life. Still to this point, I've had the most panic attacks about that topic. I don't get panic attacks anymore. I like to say my panic disorder is in remission. But that's still historically kind of the biggest tough area for me. And then it was time to work on dissertation stuff. And I looked into that topic, found that there not only was there nothing about that, but there wasn't enough research infrastructure to really talk about that issue. In fact, the sort of larger concept of like a more general sense of spiritual abuse, of something that gets in the way of our ability to practice our faith, of something that is emotionally, psychologically abusive in a spiritual or religious context. There was just very little about that. So set to work on developing the scale.
Awesome. Well, that little snippet you just shared, certainly that rings true with me. I grew up in a wonderful home and family, but in a conservative evangelical tradition where there was a lot of fear about the imminent end of the world. And of course, from that tradition, there's a sense of you're going to get whisked away in a rapture if you're in right relationship with God. And if you miss that, then you're left behind to face judgment on earth. And I remember an example of thinking that I'd missed the boat on that. So things like that, right? You kind of get those little traumas. So let me ask you this question then. Like, what is the concepts of spiritual abuse and harm? If you could say something then about those concepts, and also how they relate to or are different than just basic emotional or psychological abuse.
I use the word harm in conjunction with abuse just to sort of gesture that there is a continuum here, that abuse and trauma, generally we say trauma is the thing that happens within the person after an experience. So in a case of traumatic abuse, the abuse is the thing someone does to you, and the trauma is the symptoms and whatnot that you experience on the other end of that. So I use harm to just say it's not all trauma, it's not all abuse. It's, it can just be merely harmful. And in the second question is, I actually consider spiritual abuse, and I think most researchers would agree, as a form of emotional and psychological abuse. So it would fit under that larger umbrella, which is, things that can be traumatizing, that aren't physically abusive, that aren't sexually abusive. But this is not totally my area, but as I understand it, in the like domestic violence and similar research literature, it is now becoming evident that the emotional and psychological aspects of, for instance, domestic violence are as damaging, if not more damaging, than the physical violence present in DV experiences. And so that, that's kind of like a sister finding or something like that. It shows that, this dimension of emotional and psychological abuse can nonetheless be incredibly devastating.
Is it just that it's a specific type of emotional and psychological abuse? Is there something about it that is uniquely impactful in virtue of being spiritual?
Yes. So what we call it spiritual abuse, spiritual harm, because there is either some overt religious or spiritual element to it, like for instance, being told Jesus will return in 6 months, you will be dead just after you turn 12, right? So that's got an obvious spiritual religious dimension to it, which would be different than someone coming to me and saying, hey, there's a meteor coming in September, right? And it's April. That would not be spiritual abuse, but it would still be psychological, emotional abuse. It'd still be developmentally inappropriate thing to say to a sixth grader, right?
Right.
So, and then often there will be, if there isn't exactly a religious or spiritual element to the particular teaching, it would generally be within a religious or spiritual context. So you might have just a garden variety narcissistic leader who wants way more involvement and control over his or her followers than is healthy. And if that person merely runs, if it's like Theranos and they just run a tech company, then you wouldn't call that spiritual abuse. But you might still call it emotional and psychological abuse of your employees. But if that person is your pastor, then it carries with it different meanings, right? So that person has a different kind of power in your life than your boss has.
Mm.
Less financial power, but maybe actually kind of deeper levers of power and ability to influence you for good or bad by virtue of being a spiritual leader.
Fair to say as well with the meteorite coming that if God's the one sending the meteorite, then it still could be spiritual abuse.
That's true. If you framed it that way,
Yeah.
if you said if you did like a Pat Buchanan or something and said a meteorite's coming in 6 months because of the gay agenda, then I suppose you could maybe call that spiritual abuse.
Fair. Okay. Um, okay. So, when did you first develop the scale, and what do you envision being the applicability of the scale? Is this a tool for scholars, for pastors who can use it and benefit from it?
Yeah, I think it developed it in 2021 and it was published the next year. And I think of it as having three potential uses. The first, and the kind of first one I envisioned was a clinical use. So, and it is currently in use by some number, I don't keep track. It's freely available, but some number of clinicians, of therapists, and chaplains and people in those fields, helping professions use it with some of their clients if they think, I'd like a little closer look here. There's something going on with religious issues. And so they can give it to them in about 10 minutes or less. And then there's other research. So because it's a scale, because it has numerical reliability, validity information coming soon, but it's got reliability. So you can use it, and you could get into the statistical weeds. It's got some types of validity and not other types have not been shown yet, but I'm working on that now. So it can be compared with other research measures, and you could look at the relationship between spiritual abuse and something else. And then thirdly, there's sort of like a more of an organizational, institutional potential, and there's some movement uh, in this field as well. Denominations, other organizations that equip spiritual leaders, they could use this. They could have people take it and potential ministers or whatever, and see what comes out of that because spiritual abuse can happen, of course, to ministers, just like it can happen to lay people.
So within a workplace, there's increasing attention on the central importance of psychological safety, the ability to have a level of comfort within your environment and workplace in order to express questions, concerns, doubts, admit mistakes, learn from them individually and corporately without fear of recrimination, retribution, censure, etc.
Yeah.
Um, when I was reading through the scale and I see certain concepts being repeated with respect to, let's say, to control and fear, it seems like there are some very similar issues within religious communities. So do you resonate with that? Do you want to unpack that a bit?
I do. My wife and I watched one of those docu-series about Theranos. There was like, I think, a couple of them. We watched the one with Amanda Seyfried in it, about the kind of Silicon Valley wonderkind who was lying to her,
Mm.
big story, lying to her investors, and 3 drops of blood. We're going to do all this stuff, single drop of blood. And it never came, and it never came to fruition. And it was so interesting to watch that, uh, through the lens of spiritual abuse, and like all the different ways that she and her very tight inner circle sort of phrased and framed things, the way that they were able to sort of hold on to power much longer than they should have been able to. So I do think that these concepts are, they travel widely, right? So it's not like, I wouldn't say that the elements of spiritual abuse are uniquely spiritual. I wouldn't say that. If I had to pick, I would say the elements of spiritual abuse are human and psychological, and they can occur in spiritual places, in settings, just as well as non-spiritual settings. That's probably, if I had to pick one or the other, I would go with the latter. And then in terms of control and fear, I think that, um, there's control and fear are related to power. And how do I want to say this? This is one. Okay, I want you to take a one note right here for editing.
Sure.
So I'm just looking through my kind of notes here. You say control and fear. I think fear and control are closely related. So if I'm afraid, and if I think that whatever it is that scares me is outside of my personal control, then the natural choice for me is to like give some of that control to whichever party I think can help me. So you can think about this in terms of politics. If I'm afraid of the consequences of one political party or leader taking control, then I will give the other party or another party, Canada, you guys have parliament, give another party my vote, right? My little slice of political power to help save me or my country from whatever I perceive to be a threat. And you can do a very quick porting over of that to the spiritual realm and just say, well, I'm worried that my children will leave the faith. I'm worried that, maybe I'm just worried for my own self morally, whatever the concern might be. If I'm afraid, if I have some fear in the spiritual realm, well, I might give more of that control and power willingly to the leader of my community or other members of my community, or something like that. And yeah, so that, I don't know if that answers your question fully.
Well, it's good. In terms of fear, like, is there a, I don't know how to say it, like, oh, there's certainly a manipulative and abusive expression of fear and the use of it to manipulate in service to power. Is there a healthy fear?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. And, we talk about this as a therapist. We talk about this with anxiety with our clients. Like, some level of anxiety is not only healthy, but is actually super beneficial.
Mm.
So, I'm like, actually right now, I'm learning some new processes I'm at my doctoral internship site. I got to do this for a year, and then I can take the test and become Dr. Dan, licensed psychologist. And it's actually pretty important that, for instance, before I do an intake with a new client in a new work setting, that I have an appropriate level of anxiety and fear, that if I don't prepare for this well enough, if I don't go over my notes and remind myself, okay, what are the first 4 or 5 things I need to make sure I hit, because it's really important that we get this information, and this is not a format that I'm familiar with. That's good. That's healthy. I should be a little bit afraid of that. And then that will kick my butt into gear. So it's not like all fear is bad. I think that there's a way of interpreting the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom. in a way that makes perfect sense with that. There's also another interpretation of fear of the Lord that actually doesn't make as much sense, as being the beginning of wisdom. I think if we think of fear in a nervous system, fight, flight, or freeze model, that kind of fear, that's not the beginning of wisdom, Randall. I'll tell you that right now, because neurologically it can't be. Because when we are activated and pumping with adrenaline and ready to run away from a bear, our prefrontal cortex, the place where we actually learn things and plan, the place where wisdom gets enacted in our prefrontal cortex, as far as we can tell, it's shut off. We don't have access to it when we're petrified, when we are physically and viscerally afraid. But other kinds of fear, of that kind of like, whoa, appreciation of the awesomeness of something, appreciation of the power of something, that can be totally healthy and totally accurate.
So it's like if just a quick, let me get a quick summation that if a person's wondering, is the kind of fear I experience within my religious community more in keeping with that healthy expression of fear, or a more unhealthy, abusive, or harmful expression of fear, there are several points of analysis within the rubric you've created to help guide people through that. But just kind of big picture, like what would you say, just like 30,000 feet, kind of the gist of the differences, if you can say that?
It's a really good question. It's very hard to generalize in these
Yeah,
kinds of things. I can tell you some questions that I would ask if I were speaking with
sure.
somebody about it.
Yeah.
I would ask them questions about like their bodily sensations when they're in the environment. Do they find that their heart starts racing, that their palms get sweaty, they get goosebumps? Do they have a tendency to want to avoid certain situations because of the way it makes them feel viscerally and bodily? Well, then these are signs of like what we might call more clinical anxiety. And that's probably not the kind of more normal fear of like, well, sometimes when I'm at church, I fear for my country. Well, okay, there's things to fear for a country, right? Like that alone does not say, oh, this is some, disordered or abusive situation by itself. If you say, well, when I'm at church, I start out not fearing for my country. And then every week, my pastor will make kind of wild claims about some coming catastrophe. And then I start to fear for my country. Well, okay, that's getting a little more interesting. And on what basis are they making those claims? And what's the sort of takeaway from that? Does it end up that pastor or leader or leadership team has like more control over you and everybody else? Does it kind of naturally make you think that they are unique in their ability to advocate to the Lord on your behalf in such a way that other people couldn't? Okay, now we're getting into some much scarier waters.
Okay, that's helpful. Uh, going through the list of questions, I wanted to ask you about ones with respect to gender, and in particular, there are, as you would know, many Christian traditions that would be what we call complementarian in their
Yeah,
theology and practice. So they would say, in other words, that not every role of ministry is open to the female gender. Some are only open to males and not to females. And that would be an expression. Obviously, the Roman Catholic Church restricting the priesthood
right.
to male clergy would be the most obvious example, perhaps. So then you have these questions, two of them in particular. Number 15, something to look for is being denied opportunities to serve because of my gender. And number 16, being treated as less than because of my gender. And so myself, I have no interest in getting into the debate as
Yeah.
such, but just to understand, um, by sort of measuring that, and presumably it would, one way to interpret that would be that this would be tracking with the female experience of marginalization, perhaps in the complementarian community. Does that sort of rank complementarian theologies with respect to this as a tool as leading to spiritual harm or abuse?
So personally, I am egalitarian and queer affirming as an individual person, but I do not believe that churches having those views is necessarily spiritually abusive. it's very difficult to get the wording right for scales and measures like this. The language came from other research on spiritual abuse, where many women do report stuff that sounds like spiritual abuse kind of coming from that. My sense is that uh, you know, being denied. My sense is that there's some Christians for whom complementarianism will almost definitely cause some sort of harm to their faith, and those are women who feel called to ministry. I think it's hard to imagine a faithful woman who feels called to ministry, that like their ability to practice that faith would not be negatively impacted by being told that they must in fact be mistaken about this calling. Because like, I don't know if you've ever felt a call to ministry. I have experienced something that I feel is quite akin to that. And if someone were to tell me, Dan, obviously that's false, like you must be mistaken about that, that's pretty disorienting. A lot of the activities I've chosen to undertake in my life, in fact, many of the activities that I feel most passionate about, including spiritual abuse research, are related to that feeling of calling. And so to be told categorically that that calling must be mistaken, it's playing with fire. I don't, it's not necessarily always abusive, but for those individuals, which are not maybe most people in complementarian settings, for them, it's hard to imagine that that doesn't affect their ability to practice their faith. And, so I think that there's an interesting thing there that we could get into that I think goes through a lot of the scale, which is like, how could the person who tells the woman that, how can they be so sure? Like, in my personal view, this is a like writing a check you can't cash. Like, most people could not back that up with a strong argument against the fact that there are multiple established Christian denominations who ordain women, that there are at least open questions in New Testament scholarship about how many women preachers, deacons, elders are actually being referenced in Paul's letters in the book of Acts. So it just seems like if you can't back it up, then to me, that sounds like a misuse of whatever power you've got to basically make it, yeah, like write a check you can't cash.
So I like when I'm talking about these kinds of issues, I just like to point out to churches, church leaders, that different theologies and ecclesial expressions or the expressions of church life have different risk points for abuse. It's
Hmm,
not that they are necessarily abusive, but there are certain points at which they're at higher risk for, at the very least, lapsing into abuse. So you could have a very hierarchical church structure where you just have to do whatever the priest says because he has sacerdotal powers to withhold the sacraments or to give you
right.
sacraments for your spiritual nourishment. And that is a risk point for abuse if that priest misuses that power. It doesn't mean that the theology is wrong. That's another question, but it's a risk point. And I think similarly, you could say here that the complementarian theology of excluding women from leadership in certain roles, it's not that it's right or wrong per se, but it's a risk point for discrimination, for abuse, for harm. And we just have to be aware of that. Is that fair?
I love that language. And I would say you might have denominations that have certain types of more risk or less risk, not even just tracking with how liberal or conservative they are. So you might have a liberal denomination where, as in your case, the priest or pastor holds a lot of power, spiritual power, controlling sacraments, things like this. Or you can have a conservative denomination where what makes someone ordained is essentially that they say they are. They say God called me, and maybe they get one or two other quote unquote godly men to confirm that. And Bob's your uncle. You're now a pastor with spiritual authority over a bunch of people. And that's a different kind of risk point.
Mhm.
Would you call it risk point? Risk?
Yeah, risk points. Yeah.
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 So then it's like, well, if something does happen, like what can you do about it? Maybe very little, but maybe in the first example of a denomination where, hey, this guy's got all this power, or this woman even has all this power, but if they err, there is a process and there are people above them who can fire them, essentially. So you might have risk points along 4 to 10 sort of different continuums, different types of risk at different sort of institutional or otherwise buffers against that risk, is how I would think of it.
Yeah, that's well said. Can I ask you, what is the role? I think similar to shame, or sorry, to fear. I'm wondering, what is the role, if any, for shame or guilt? Is there a healthy expression of these things? And again, when do these things become abusive or harmful? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I have to lean into therapy language here. And the
Hmm.
most common distinction between guilt and shame that therapists use is guilt is feeling bad about something I did or failed to do. Guilt is connected to an action or a lack of an action, a decision or something like that.
Hmm.
Shame we use to describe a more global feeling about myself as a whole.
Hmm.
And so I think that, I think it's probably pretty theologically airtight in almost all Christian understandings to say guilt makes a lot of sense and shame makes a lot less sense. I think unless maybe you're Calvinist and the person in question is one of the unelect, maybe. I don't think Calvinists would admit this, that that would be a proper use of shame. But generally speaking, right, we Christians who have any sort of active life of faith believe that God does not sort of primarily see those parts of ourselves, that like, we are a new creation in Christ. There's all this kind of language about, born again, whatever. So shame doesn't, you know, we're not courting shame. Shame is not really a Christian concept. I think guilt can be, and then guilt. If you're feeling guilty and it's accurate, then you got to do something about it.
Okay. Um, what if a person senses that they are in a community that has some level of abuse or harm? How would you say that they go about assessing when you got to cut ties, essentially? When does it become such that it's not worth investing anymore? It's too much harm or risk to the individual to remain.
This is the $1 million question, Randall, and unfortunately, it does depend so much on an individual situation. It
Mhm.
depends on how resilient you are. In what areas are you resilient or non-resilient? Like, is this touching on other parts of your story or your past in such a way that it's just really difficult to handle in the moment? How deep does the lack of health go in the institution? Is this the kind of thing where if you were to really say something or advocate for something that you're going to be in a strong minority? Or is it the kind of thing where there seem to be a few bad apples here, but I'm pretty sure everybody is on board with what I'm seeing. And maybe we just need to get some collective action going, and maybe that will really solve it. It's so hard to weigh in on that without any details about how that's going. There are a couple sort of objective ways that you can look at it. First you can check out the spiritual harm and abuse scale, and you can kind of read through it and sort of assess like, hey, how much of this applies to my community? And if it's not very many items, then you go, this is maybe something that's really doable. If you start to go, okay, we kind of do all of this stuff, well, you know, set your expectations accordingly. Um, there is also a flip side of this, and I love it. Lisa Oakley, who is another spiritual abuse researcher out of the University of Chester in the UK. Her and her co-author Justin Humphreys, they have a book called Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse,
Mhm.
and they list a bunch of features of like abuse-resistant, healthy religious communities. So you can look for the abusive signs, but you can also look for the healthy signs. I'll read a few of those off here, but you'd want to get the book to kind of get more in depth. But there's stuff like transparency and accountability, Is there some respect by leadership for the individual autonomy of the believers in the group? Or is there expectation that everybody basically gets on the bus together? Um, is there any welcoming of diversity, diversity of thought, as well as sort of ethnic and other types of diversity? Does the leadership show compassion? Is there any kind of open dialogue when significant questions arise, or is it all done unilaterally? Are there healthy boundaries? Your pastor should not be your accountant. Like there are items on my scale that kind of gesture at this of like, a healthy pastor might say, hey, here's some ways to think biblically about dating and sex. Or they might say from within our tradition or something like that. It's another thing to be like Pastor Kevin's 5 rules, and they're Kevin's rules. They're like his specific rules. That's a red flag. So there are things like this that you can look at.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I will say that as an aside, my pastor is also my plumber, and it actually works out pretty well because he's got a lot of skills at plumbing. So he helped me install a hot water tank a couple of years ago. So sometimes it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to love the tent making there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Dan, it's been great chatting with you, and I would encourage people to again look you up online at dankochwords.com. What you're doing on spiritual abuse and harm is enormously important. I think the scale you provided is a very valuable heuristic tool to just help people to begin to even even a layperson can, I think, just go through and begin to get a sense of the kind of questions they should be asking and to kind of get that objective perspective of a third party of some of the things they might be looking for within their communities.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'll just anecdotally to that end, I'll say I got way more responses on the initial survey than I anticipated. I ended up having 3,200 full
Oh,
survey responses, and it came from people sharing it with each other. And I think it was the kind of thing I got many emails and comments to this end that it was like just having language for this felt really powerful to people. And so they couldn't wait to share it with other people that they thought would also find that language helpful. And so I do think there's something there about just even if a bunch of it doesn't apply, just read the words, see what it sparks in you, and see if it can um, lead towards some more clarity.
excellent. I agree fully. Thanks a lot, Dan. It's been great speaking with you today.
Thanks for having me.